I'm super excited to chat. We are recording here. So just to give, I guess, yourself a little bit of a perspective here, and any listeners is, so I've been working on basically a macronutrient series for quite some time now. I wrote the carbohydrate one a couple of years ago. I wrote the protein one a little over a year and a half ago or so. And I've been working on the fat one for the last, ever since.
Right, sure.
And to me, this is the most, I think, important, most misunderstood, maybe most important. I should use that carefully, but definitely, I think the most misunderstood macronutrient there is.
For sure.
So for context, I came across Peter at Hyperlipid's work quite some time ago.
Sure.
And he took me down the rabbit hole. And earlier this year, I found yourself, I found fireinaBottle.net. And I have to tell you, it was, I'm a voracious reader. It is my favorite reading I've done in a very, very long time. Like a kid at a candy store. So I've been looking forward to talking to you basically all year. I read the entire blog earlier this year. I have over 60 pages of notes. I think I may have more words of notes than the blog itself. Like it just took me in the rabbit hole. So anyways, I'm super excited to talk.
Excellent.
I was preparing for this and I was like, all right, I got to whittle down my 60 pages of notes. And I whittled it down to like 14 pages.
Okay. So that's a good start.
So when I'm reading your blog, and I don't know if you purposely did this, but I kind of divided it into 4 chapters, so to speak, in my head. We got the ROS theory of obesity. We got the SCD1 theory. We have metabolism and metabolic rate, probably my favorite one. And then most recently, reductive stress. Is that how you organized it in your head?
I mean, I think those are kind of the rabbit holes that I went down in the time that I was writing it. And so, yeah, absolutely. And the metabolic rate is really maybe the thread that kind of, holds it all together, right? Because the ROS theory of obesity and SCD1 and reductive stress, like they're all tied into metabolic rate, right? Somehow or another. And, and more, the more I learn and look and read and, all the things, it is feeling like recently I've been writing about reductive stress, and I do think that there's something there, and it's probably just availability of NAD plus that is really at the kind of like that is like sort of the master controller of all of this. But then it's really interesting how the different fats are affecting the NAD plus levels. Mm-hmm. And it's really multifaceted how it all works. It's kind of crazy, part of it is generating ROS, right? And so I don't know how technical your reader or listeners are, but so ROS in the beginning, when I started writing the ROS theory of obesity, and like I say, obviously I was introduced to that concept by Peter at Hyperlipid. And when I was originally writing that, I was thinking about ROS, our reactive oxygen species. Basically, what happens is in the mitochondria, we're basically transferring electrons from the foods that we eat into this electron transport chain, and it makes ATP. But some of the electrons come back out, and they combine with oxygen to make something called superoxide. Which, I like to make and do a little cartoon figure with like a mohawk, and he's got like a cape. He got a cape because he's like superoxide. He's like Superman, but he's got a mohawk because he's a free radical. And, anyway, that's what superoxide is in my head, is that little cartoon character. And so, but that, anyway, so those electrons that ping back out of the electron transport chain make superoxide, and that gets pretty rapidly converted into hydrogen peroxide. And the sort of neat thing about hydrogen peroxide is it's both a a reactive oxygen species, which is to say that it has the ability to oxidize things, but it also is soluble in water and it's soluble in fat, which means that it can just diffuse out of the mitochondria in a way that superoxide cannot do, because superoxide has a negative charge and it can't go through a fatty membrane.
Yep.
And so hydrogen peroxide winds up being the thing that is building up or not in the cell. And when it does build up, certain enzymes are activated or deactivated by the buildup of hydrogen peroxide, such as insulin signaling, such as certain molecules in or certain enzymes in glycolysis, and even in the TCA cycle. I believe aconitase in the TCA cycle can be deactivated if hydrogen peroxide builds up too much. And so, you know, I took, what do they call it? Cancer. There's a better word for that. Oncology at Cornell. It's going to age me a bit, but I think it was probably 1996. And, you know, back then, you know, free radicals were just, you know, they were dangerous. They caused cancer. Bad. They were bad. Right. And so then reading Hyperlipid, it gets you thinking, you're like, oh, well, there's got to be more to this. They're not just bad. They're actually playing this interesting physiological role. Right. And so I was thinking about, these free radicals, superoxide, as signaling molecules. But then, you know, as I've learned more and more and more, I've thought a lot more about the overall redox balance of the cell. Right. And so now you have the mitochondria, and so the one of the big things that definitely happens is that saturated fat drives more ROS production in the mitochondria than do unsaturated fats. And really that means all unsaturated, like oleic acid, monounsaturated fat drives way less ROS than does saturated fat. And so that's a key switch. And of course we, you know, with the SCD1 theory of obesity, SCD1 is this enzyme and it just converts saturated fat to monounsaturated fat. And so it's controlling the ratio of fats, and it's essentially controlling how much of this superoxide we produce when we're burning fat. Yep. And so that is having this downstream effect of controlling the whole redox balance of the cell. And, you know, and redox balance just means, it's a fancy sounding word. It's really just kind of like how many of these high energy floating electrons there are around, because, like, you know, the energy in our food comes from the hydrocarbon bonds. You know, like fat is just carbon and hydrogen stuck together. So each of those bonds has a pair of electrons, and when it comes
reduced,
right, it's reduced. Right, that's what it is. That's a reduced. Those enzymes or those electrons are in the reduced state, and what's going to happen? You know, oxygen is like the big bully. So if we think of these electrons as like your lunch money and oxygen's the bully, oxygen always wants to take your lunch money. You know, it always wants to take those electrons. And so what happens is when those electrons go back to oxygen, there's a bunch of energy given off. Right. And so that's the whole, that's how we make ATP. Right. And so normally those electrons get carried to the electron transport chain by NAD. NAD plus is the oxidized version. It's lost its electrons, but when we burn, you know, fat or glucose, it gets 2 electrons from the glucose and it takes it up to the electron transport chain and it drops them off. So it's NADH when it has the 2 electrons. So it's in the reduced state when it has the electrons, drops them off to make ATP, and then it's NAD plus again, and then it can pick up 2 more electrons. So, you know, it's like a taxi. It's like a taxi for electrons, right? And oxygen needs to get the electrons, and the electrons start in our food. So when I say reductive stress, all that really means is that all of the NAD is already in the NADH form. And so we can't keep burning food because there's no NAD plus left. So we can't, you know, or insufficient NAD plus is a better way to say it. There's always some. And so our metabolism slows down because there's not enough NAD plus, and it's all NADH, and they already have electrons, and we're not burning enough calories, and there's nowhere for the electrons to go, right?
Absolutely. And
that's
I think one of the key things that, and I definitely would want to come back to this part and like unwind it a bit, but one of the key things, it seems like the reason we have the inadequate NAD plus to keep running the Krebs cycle is because we are not generating enough ROS. And so that, to me, seems like that is the precursor to inadequate NAD plus. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And so on my blog recently, I've been writing a lot about an enzyme called NNT, because so I spent a lot of time thinking about the redox balance, and what happens is, okay, so an electron comes out, and you get this superoxide. Superoxide, there's an enzyme called superoxide dismutase, very rapidly converts the superoxide to hydrogen peroxide. And that doesn't take any energy. It's just magic that the enzyme does. And so now you've got hydrogen peroxide. And what hydrogen peroxide is turned back to water by this thing called glutathione.
Yep.
And there's an enzyme, which I think is, I forget the name of the enzyme that does it. Anyways. And so, but once glutathione is involved in that reaction of converting hydrogen peroxide back to water, it becomes oxidized glutathione. And so in my head, I was like, okay, well, if the glutathione gets oxidized, the only way to, it has to then get reduced so that it can be used, so that it can deal with another molecule of hydrogen peroxide. Exactly. Okay, so well, how does that happen? Well, there's an enzyme called glutathione reductase. And what that does is it takes, so there's another thing called NADPH, which is very much like NADH, except it has a phosphate group on it. But the cell keeps like a separate pool of NADPH from NADH and uses them for different things, right? And so I was like, okay, well, if every time there's a hydrogen peroxide, what happens is glutathione reductase takes an NADPH and it converts it to an NADP plus. Yep. And it uses that, so the NADPH is getting oxidized and the glutathione is getting reduced. Because in a redox reaction, one thing's always getting reduced and one thing's always getting oxidized. And that's done by the enzyme glutathione reductase. And bam, now you've got your glutathione that's ready to remove another hydrogen peroxide, and you have this NADP plus.
Yep.
And I'm like, okay, but right, somewhere in the cell, and then what happened is the guy, I'm gonna space out his name. It'll come to me. Natambi is his name. He's done a lot of the work with SCD1, and he came out with a great paper in 2020. And so the thing about SCD1 is they made these mice that don't have this enzyme SCD1, and so therefore they can't convert their saturated fat to monounsaturated fat. Yep. And the cool thing about these mice was that they have really high metabolic rates, and they're totally resistant to obesity. And the only difference between them and normal mice is they literally just can't make monounsaturated fat. Yep. And so their body fat is very saturated when you look at it. And so they came out with this paper that showed that those high metabolic rate mice that didn't have SCD1 have a very high level of NAD plus. And so I knew that I knew the way that we detoxify the hydrogen peroxide is by creating, it creates NADP plus. And I knew that mice who only have saturated fat, who therefore presumably are generating a lot of hydrogen peroxide, had a ton of NAD plus, right? So you're like, well, there's got to be something that's that is taking that NAD plus from getting rid of the hydrogen peroxide and converting it back to, taking the NADP plus that we get from getting rid of the hydrogen peroxide and converting it to NAD plus, because they're very similar things. I was like, there's got to be an enzyme that does it somewhere. And I was just like Googling, and I looked at a bunch of different things, and there's some redundant ways it probably happens. But finally, I stumbled across this thing called NNT, and I was like, this is it. So NNT sits in the membrane right next to the electron transport chain, and it actually uses the proton gradient as fuel, and it takes the NADP plus from getting rid of the hydrogen peroxide, and it gives us back NAD plus. And so what it does is it maintains the pool of NADPH, and it gives us back NAD plus. And so that was the key, like the eureka moment that like tied the whole system, because I knew there something had to be going on there. I'm like, right, because you're looking at the thing and you're like, okay, well, it's the hydrogen peroxide is making all this NADP plus, but then there's got to be a connector here. There's got to be an enzyme doing this, and and NNT there's a community of people doing research about it, and Cody Smith in North Carolina is one, and like he has some great papers out there. And he is really the one. He has this fantastic paper where they show that basically NNT is capable of, or normal cells with NNT are capable of getting rid of like 70% of hydrogen peroxide generated in the mitochondria before it ever leaves the mitochondria. In a normal functioning system, it's a very efficient system of converting those the reactive oxygen species back to NAD plus. Yep. And the NAD plus, of course, is what drives our metabolism forward. And so, it's a nice little system once you figure it out. But yeah, it took some, it took a lot of searching. I'm like, yeah.
Well, one of the things that I mean, when I read this about this latest part on reductive stress, to me, it really did feel like kind of put a bow on it, at least a little bit, because I know you are like mostly focused around like obesity, and that has been like my number one interest with metabolism and obesity.
Right.
And all roads to me seem to lead to thermogenesis and mitochondrial uncoupling. And people who are obese and can't get out of it, something is going wrong where they're not doing the thermogenesis and they don't get the mitochondrial uncoupling to release energy, excess energy as heat versus storing excess energy as fat. And it had bothered me for many, many years to be like, but why, like, what is the switch that makes someone like, because I feel like there's a lipostat, right? And if I starve myself right now, my body's going to do a bunch of things to make sure I eat more and I get my body fat back up high.
Right.
And the light switch should work the other direction too. We get fat, we put, leptin starts pumping out more. Mm-hmm. There's these mechanisms that should get us back down. And I'm always like, once we get to a point, it seems like the body wants to keep putting on more fat. And like, to me, it doesn't make sense. To me, that's like broken metabolism. But I love how you reframe that, because I agree, is this may not be pathology, but this may be by design, metabolic design of, I call them like a hibernating metabolism.
Exactly.
Which I found, which really, it does like connect all this together, because it's like,
it does, right? Because now you're like, oh, there's actually a reason that it's all like this.
Exactly. Because usually I'm like, biology's not doing something to kill us like crazy, right?
Right. It's trying to help us get through winter, and what you start to see is that in a lot of these systems, once things start to point in the direction of fattening, there's all these positive feedback loops that just keep pushing it in that direction. It's like SCD1 creates monounsaturated fat, and monounsaturated fat increases SCD1. You know what I mean? So and normally with enzymes, are inhibited by their end product, because if there's enough of the end product, you already have enough of it. You don't have to keep making it. Exactly. But in the case of SCD1, it's like, oh, well, we started making this monounsaturated fat, and now we have this monounsaturated fat. And so now it looks like we're getting fat. So, I guess I need to make even more. You know what I mean? So it's like, and there's tons of these things. And then, of course, once you get monounsaturated fat, now you get, that's when you get reductive stress in the mitochondria, because you can't burn the the thing that I was talking about in my last blog post that I also realized is that so the generation of reactive oxygen species is not only in the electron transport chain, is not only providing NAD plus, but it's basically, bringing more total oxygen in, it's burning more total oxygen in the mitochondria. Because at the end of the day, our metabolism is controlled by how much oxygen we burn. And guess what? Every time that we, an electron comes back out and we make a superoxide, the superoxide is that electron combining with O2, with oxygen. And so it's like, instead of just the traditional view is that oxygen is only consumed at complex 4 of the electron transport chain. But in fact, all of this superoxide production is also consuming oxygen, and it's getting rid of those electrons, and it's reducing the overall, redox balance of the cell back towards oxidized, at complex 1 and at complex, I think 2 or not 2, but complex 1 and complex 3 and complex 4 are in fact all burning oxygen to ensure that the fuel burns cleanly and that we don't have a buildup of acetyl-CoA, except that when all of our fat is monounsaturated, we don't have we're not burning as much oxygen at complexes 1 and complexes 3. And so then you don't have as much NAD plus coming back, and you end up with too much NADH and not enough oxygen, basically, right? Like, we need to get more oxygen into the mix, and with MUFA you can't do it. And so hibernating animals, of course, massively increase SCD1. They're full of MUFA. Tons of studies have shown this. If you look at bear fat, it's all MUFA. Yep. And so all of these hibernating animals are eating PUFA to spark this initial flipping on of SCD1, and then they fill up ultimately with monounsaturated fat, and then that slows their metabolic rate down. Acetyl-CoA builds up, their mitochondrial enzymes become acetylated, and the acetyl groups also turn on the lipogenic transcription factors, SREB-P1C, PPAR gamma, both get turned on by acetylation, whereas your mitochondrial enzymes that are burning fat get turned off by acetylation, right? And so at every level, you just see this like, okay, well, first we made too much MUFA, but then, that allowed the acetyl-CoA levels to go up, and that turned off our fat burning enzymes, and then it turned on the transcription factors that make the lipogenic enzymes. And so it's just, it's all positive feedback loops, and then until you're fat. And so it's like, it's a really well-designed system if the goal is to make sure that you fatten up for winter.
Right. And you use less oxygen consumption, which is basically the definition of decreased metabolic rate.
Exactly.
And you're not regenerating the NAD plus, which is not going to turn on the sirtuins that you need to deacetylate the mitochondrial enzymes. So you're stuck sleeping, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure you saw it, but there was a bunch of experiments done even in the like mid 90s, or I think even in the 80s. I think the first one was like 1987 maybe. And where they fed hibernating squirrels either lamb suet, like lamb kidney fat, or whatever, sunflower oil or something. And when those squirrels tried to hibernate, the ones that were given the lamb suet just couldn't get their metabolic rate all the way down, and then they woke up prematurely from hibernation, and they just literally can't hibernate if you don't give them enough polyunsaturated fat. And this has been known forever, 35 years or something. For a long time. And and it still hasn't really caught on, but we're getting there.
I think you're doing super interesting, like very interesting work, because I tweet about stuff like this, and it's not really like known anywhere.
Yeah.
I tweeted out something today or yesterday that very controversial. I said saturated fat doesn't cause heart disease.
Right.
And it's just, you shouldn't tweet that unless you want to get hate mail. But getting ready for this, I'm reading all about saturated fat, and I'm like, I mean, the body can't be designed to be like you're eating this macronutrient that really we need to thrive.
Right.
Also clogging our arteries. So I was thinking maybe real quick, we review ROS theory. I got a couple questions related to that. SCD theory, questions to that. So just to kind of, I'll put it in a little nutshell. I got my notes here. ROS theory, basically we take saturated fat, which is going to have a higher ratio of FADH2 to NADH, going to create a bottleneck in the mitochondrial electron transport chain at coenzyme Q specifically.
Right.
It's going to cause reverse electron transport. So basically spit those electrons out, going to create the ROS, which is superoxide, which gets converted to hydrogen peroxide. And that's basically the signal, right? So that's what we say. This is the signal. And so I want to talk about a couple of those signals. The first one that you mentioned was turns off insulin signaling, right? So it's a way the cell's like, enough energy here, insulin, I see you knocking at the door, but we're not going to answer that.
Right, exactly. And the idea being, and of course people hear that and they think, oh, well, that's bad, right? We don't want to be insulin resistant, right? And so it's already a controversial thing to say, but but it really depends. If you're a fat cell and you're already fat, insulin is a signal to take in energy, right? To take in blood glucose, and so what you don't want your fat cells doing is taking in a bunch of blood glucose because they have a low metabolic rate. And what are they going to do with it? They're going to turn it into more fat. That's one of the major sources of lipogenesis in the body is your fat cells. And so, the idea is that when your fat cells are burning saturated fat, they have got all the fat. So they're the first one that kind of starts burning fat when like in the postprandial state or whatever. And so you want them to quickly generate ROS and stop taking in glucose. Your muscle cells can still take in that blood glucose and make glycogen and burn it, to keep your overall body's, blood glucose correct, right? But you don't want your adipose tissue and your liver to keep taking in sugar and making fat out of it, right? And so that's basically the idea there.
So what are your thoughts about this? You have this large amount of ROS because you have high saturated fat. It blocks the insulin signaling, which one of your blog posts really, nicely says, yes, insulin brings energy in, but it also, is very it basically is going to let you stop breaking down fat. But because you're not doing that, you're able to keep leaking free fatty acids into the blood. So there's a period where it's mostly talked about like in the carbohydrate insulin model, where you have this period where insulin sucked up all the energy. So then you get, hypoglucose and it makes you hungry and such. But when you don't respond to insulin, the fat cell is able to more quickly continue to release fat into the bloodstream. That kind of prevents this postprandial hunger.
Right. And so you can see that there's a study done in Spain where they gave people, a meal of glucose or, I think it was bread with a fat, and it was either, butter or, I can't remember the exact fats they use, but let's say it was butter or sunflower oil. Right.
Yep.
And I think they use olive oil. And so what you see is, yes, so insulin, so your fat cells release free fatty acids to kind of feed the body, right? Yep. And insulin, the first thing it does in the fat cells is the fat cells stop releasing free fatty acids in response to insulin. So you're no longer burning your own body fat once insulin is doing its thing. And so, so if you eat bread and butter, essentially, your fat cells become insulin resistant sooner and those free fatty acids rebound much quicker. Whereas if you eat bread and sunflower oil, it takes a lot longer for the free fatty acids to return to the baseline value. And so it takes a lot longer to get back to burning your body fat after you eat vegetable oil than if you eat butter. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep. And so do you worry about because if you think about this insulin resistance being a good thing in this context, fat cells being insulin resistant, you would think you eat a postprandial, you'll have higher blood sugar levels, because if all the cells are, hypothetically full, you'll have higher blood sugar for longer. Is that
right? Right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I'm like, there's this big trend on, nutrition Twitter and elsewhere of people wearing continuous glucose monitors. And I'm kind of like I'm not sure what I'm not sure what I want to see postprandial. Like,
that's kind of
people are like, oh, I can't eat this, I get a high postprandial glucose response. And I'm like, well, maybe you're supposed to have a high postprandial glucose.
Maybe that was good.
I mean, you're probably not really, but I think that's more. There's a first phase insulin response that happens just in your liver.
Yep.
And that is actually the thing that, as people become closer to diabetic, that's like the first thing that you lose, is that first pass insulin. And so in people with really good glycemic control, what's happening is the liver is grabbing a lot of that glucose as it comes in, and it's making it into glycogen.
Yep.
And so those people have a small, glycemic whatever after a meal. But let's say that you are sort of a person who's already lost that first phase, then you're probably going to have a high blood glucose response after a meal. But I'm not sure. Like, it's unclear to me if, right. It's like if I eat butter with rice, I might have a higher insulin curve than if I eat sunflower oil with rice. That doesn't make it a good idea. But I think with people using, continuous glucose monitors, I think you can get some really bad ideas from that by always assuming that lower glucose curves are always better. I'm not sure that's a correct thing to say.
Yeah, and it reminds me, I think it's probably your blog where it's talking about this as well, where there's these diabetic medications that are effective, and it's effective. They effectively control blood sugar, but make you super fat. So basically,
exactly.
It's like, yeah, exactly. So we're controlling your blood sugar better, but you are getting super fat on this medication.
Right. It's controlling it because you're taking it and making fat with it.
Exactly.
It's like, okay, yeah, and what I think you were talking about rosiglitazone probably, which is a
right.
So it's a PPAR gamma activator, and PPAR gamma increases SCD1. So if you increase SCD1, you can take in all this glucose and you can turn it into fat very effectively, and that makes your blood glucose go down.
Right.
And so yeah.
so there's that. And so I like to talk about the next ROS signal. So ROS, reactive oxygen species, that's the signal for a lot of these things. One that I find super interesting is like its effect on transcription factors, notably UCP1, UCP3, and NRF2. And just so kind of I'll run by my understanding of this, and then we can dive a little deeper into it. RCP1 is this mitochondrial uncoupling in brown fat. Humans don't have a lot of brown fat. Things like mice do. So the mice experiments show like much more kind of, I would say, enhanced effects here.
Right.
But UCP3 is mitochondrial uncoupling in muscle. And so ROS turns on transcription factors that turns on mitochondrial uncoupling, which is basically this way I think about it. ROS signals oxidative stress. The cell's like, I want to get rid of this oxidative stress. So we turn on various pathways to relieve it. One being mitochondrial uncoupling. So it's basically, we got this oxidative stress, we're going to release it by releasing heat, thermogenesis. Also, NRF2 does it via upregulating glutathione, basically, to get like we're talking about, right?
Yeah, and I would have to look, but I'm pretty sure that NRF2 also upregulates UCP3. I'm like 60% sure of that.
but we know this mitochondrial uncoupling is increasing in response to ROS.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
There was, let's see, I had a note here. Let's see. So NRF2 is transcription factor. Basically, this signaling the cell, the way I think about it, there's oxidative stress, so let's upregulate antioxidant production like glutathione,
Right.
which we were talking about, which is this pathway that we need to basically get rid of what would be reductive stress and regenerate NAD plus.
Right.
So one thing that I noted, NRF2 decreases SCD1. Is that right?
I don't think that's right. In fact,
that wouldn't make sense to me. That's why I put a question.
No, I think if anything, NRF2 might somehow increase SCD1, which is a concern. And so my view on uncoupling proteins and NRF has become a lot more nuanced as I've learned about things. So one thing is that when you look at cancer cells, or if you look at obese people, they often have a lot of glutathione. And so what's happening is so they do have oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is causing the NRF2 upregulation, and that's upregulating the glutathione to deal with it. But now what you have is you have all of this you have this huge load of reduced glutathione. Right. And so it's sort of building on to the reductive stress, right? Because you're building this huge pool of like reduced things. And of course they're in different redox pools, but still they all have different ways of like communicating with each other. And I think that but then, so why do cells have oxidative stress in the first place? I think that's a really important question. And what I keep coming back to is that, so what happens is, as I've said, in a functioning mitochondria, 70% of the hydrogen peroxide that's produced in the mitochondria is dealt with right there in the mitochondria by NNT and glutathione reductase and the whole system, right? Superoxide dismutase, they're all there, they're working in unison. They basically you can generate a ton of superoxide, but the mitochondria won't release a ton of hydrogen peroxide in a healthy cell, and so the cell doesn't go into oxidative stress, even if you're making a lot of ROS, right? But what happens is, as reductive stress takes over the cell, well, now your NNT becomes acetylated.
Yep. And
it's not functioning effectively to remove or to replace the NAD plus, and your NAD pH levels start to drop. And now glutathione reductase can't work effectively to get rid of the hydrogen peroxide because NAD pH levels have dropped because NNT isn't replacing the NAD pH, right? And so I think and also if you have a buildup, if you have tons and tons of NADH, they're all trying to dump their electrons onto complex 1. And so reductive stress, by a different mechanism, also generates a lot of superoxide because you have all this NADH. And so you have all this kind of like electron pressure, they call it, which is a term that I don't love, but it's sort of evocative of what's really kind of happening. You have all this NADH and it's just all trying to dump its electrons. And so you get, so in that scenario, so now you have reductive stress and you're still generating a lot of like I say, a lot of superoxide because of all the NADH has all those electrons and they got to go somewhere.
Yep.
However, the system to clean it all up and replace the NAD plus is now acetylated and it's not functioning. And so now the mitochondria is dumping huge amounts of hydrogen peroxide into the rest of the cell. And so that's why I wrote the post recently that reductive stress is the source of oxidative stress, which sounds counterintuitive, but once you understand how all the parts work, it actually makes sense.
It does make sense because that was a tough one for me to wrap my head around because I didn't fully understand the reductive stress relieving mechanisms.
Right. Yeah. Well, I didn't totally understand it either. That's one of the reasons I wrote the article was to force myself to actually figure that, because there's been a lot of review papers written about it, and I'm like reading the review papers and I'm like, I don't think they understand it either. They're just like making these weird arguments about like, it's like they can see that it's true, but they don't really understand it. And they're writing these review papers saying like, well, if this is overcompensating for that and that's overcompensating for this, and it's back and forth. And I'm like, right. Well, that's not really a good answer either. Right. So it's, and the more I talk about it, the more it starts to make sense. I'm like, okay, yeah.
Starting to see it. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's all just kind of, yeah.
So would you define, how would you define good oxidative stress versus bad oxidative stress? Because when I think of ROS, I think oxidative stress may not be the best word for it, because we want this ROS.
So I think of oxidative stress as a change in redox balance.
Okay.
Right. And so anytime we're talking about change, you have ROS in and you have ROS out. Yep. Right. And so you can create oxidative stress either by increasing ROS in, or by decreasing ROS out, or by both. Right. And so I think in a healthy functioning cell, what's happening is you're generating plenty of superoxide and you're very efficiently dealing with it in the mitochondria. That cell is going to have a high metabolic rate. It's not going to be an oxidative stress because even though it's generating a lot of superoxide, it's not going to build up, right? Yep. NNT's there, glutathione reductase, they're all doing their thing. And that cell's going to have a very high metabolic rate. And you can show this in cells. Like if you take a cell culture, a tissue culture, and all you do is overexpress the enzyme NNT, their metabolic rate goes up 10% just with that one enzyme. And if you put in a microRNA that reduces expression of NNT, their metabolic rate drops 10%. And interestingly, that 10% one way or the other variation in metabolic rate that you can do in a tissue culture lab or a tissue culture is just about the same as the difference in metabolic rate that we saw historically happen like in the American South in the 1930s, right? Their metabolic rate was down by about 10%. And when you look at people like the Tsimane, who have a very high metabolic rate in the Amazon, their metabolic rate is maybe, 15 to 20% higher than modern people, which are in turn 10% lower than what they used to be. And so that range of about 10% one way or the other from the median, you can do that in tissue culture with NNT, and it seems to be the kind of like historical variation among different peoples as well. And so when you see that kind of correlation, you're like, okay, well that's very consistent.
Yeah.
It doesn't prove anything, but it gives you an idea that maybe I'm, not completely crazy. Maybe I'm on the right track.
I think so. And so I have a question, and one before we jump in a little bit about SCD1 is, I thought about this a lot because blood, basically hypothalamus sensing energy, leptin, blunts appetite. I always think like a diabetic with high blood sugar, high triglycerides, they should have a low appetite because the hypothalamus should say, there's so much energy here. Like, why am I eating?
Right.
Do you have can you help me out with this question? And what made me think about this is like the ROS creating the insulin resistance, the good kind of insulin resistance, higher blood sugar, hypothalamus sees that, says we're satiated. There's plenty of food here.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that is, I think that's tied in to the whole idea of torpor, right? Like if we have mistakenly switched our body into this alternate metabolism that we're trying to fatten up for winter, of course, if you're a bear, bears in the fall when they're fattening up become hyperphagic, which just means they overeat. right? And so one of the things that you have to do to fatten up, to hibernate, is to become leptin resistant. Right? If you don't become leptin resistant, your metabolic rate is just going to increase exponentially. And no matter how much you eat, you're going to burn off all the calories, right? And so you have to, and more, and this is total speculation. I haven't really researched this, but I'm wondering if leptin resistance is really just lack of NAD plus. And the reason that I think that is the main thing that leptin, or one of the main things leptin does, is it activates AMP kinase. And AMP kinase is a key metabolic regulator. It upregulates all of these enzymes that basically make our metabolism go.
Right. And
AMP kinase is activated by SIRT1. Yep. And SIRT1 is an NAD plus dependent deacetylase. And so deacetylase. And so without NAD plus, SIRT1 isn't activated. Without SIRT1, leptin can't activate AMP kinase, and therefore leptin can't increase our metabolic rate to help us burn off the fat. And one of the things that AMP kinase does is it downregulates SCD1. And so when the SCD1 so when you eat the PUFA, right? So here's the sequence of events. You eat PUFA, you're making less ROS, you get reductive stress, which means low levels of NAD plus. The reductive stress turns on SCD1. So now all of your saturated fat is becoming MUFA.
Yep.
The MUFA keeps you in reductive stress. And so now leptin is trying to turn on AMP kinase as you get fatter and say, hey, we have extra energy, we need to burn it off.
Yep.
But since there's no NAD plus, because you're making all the SCD1, the AMP or the leptin cannot signal the AMP kinase, which in a normal system would turn off the SCD1. Yep. And would allow you to increase your metabolic rate and burn off the extra calories, but you can't do it because you don't have the NAD plus.
So does leptin, and I don't know this, does leptin directly upregulate SCD1 or indirectly only?
It directly activates AMP kinase, and AMP kinase downregulates SCD1. And there might be an intermediary step. I don't remember, but
because AMP kinase also, I mean, like you said, it does a lot. It basically turns up CPT1, which is going to keep the fat flowing into the mitochondria. But if AMP kinase isn't getting the signal, then that whole chain of events is
right, exactly. But the turning off of the SCD1 is a very important function of AMP kinase, because interestingly, this is where, I mean, this is what I love about biology. It keeps you thinking and it keeps you guessing, right? So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about. Well, I went on David Gornowski's show with Ray Pete, actually.
It's on my to watch list.
Yeah, well, it's fine, but one of the things, and actually it was a previous. We had like a omega-6 panel with a bunch of us, and Ray Pete was on there, and one of the things he said was that the problem with PUFA is it goes into the mitochondria too fast, and that's what causes reductive stress. That's what Ray Pete said, and I said, well, that is very interesting, because typically, just as you say, things like PPAR alpha is the master regulator of fat burning. It increases CPT1, and I'm pretty sure that AMP kinase directly stimulates PPAR alpha, which then stimulates CPT1 is really what happens. Mm-hmm. And so and I was like, well, if Ray Pete is right that flooding the mitochondria with fat causes reductive stress, which is a reasonable assertion because, fat is full of acetyl groups. And so if you can shuttle enough fat into the mitochondria quickly and do beta oxidation, you're creating a ton of acetyl groups, which is ultimately the cause of reductive stress, right? So if that builds up too fast and you're not generating enough NAD plus, very quickly, you're going to have an overload of acetyl-CoA, which is what leads to all the reductive stress, right? And so I started looking into it, and then I found out that they did a study in, I don't know, it was 2008 or something. Maybe it was after that, 2012. Doesn't matter. But they realized that in mice, they could put them into torpor just by giving them a PPAR activator, a PPAR alpha activator, right? So all they're doing is they're giving them this drug which increases CPT1 and increases the rate at which fat is entering the mitochondria, and that puts the mice into reductive stress. But then I went into the materials and methods of the paper, and of course, the diet that the mice were on, half of the fat calories were from corn oil. And so then I was like, okay, I get it. So if you can flood the mitochondria with unsaturated fats, then you're going to create reductive stress, put things into torpor, etc.
Right.
But if the thing that is stimulating PPAR alpha is AMP kinase, AMP kinase is turning off SCD1 at the same time that it's increasing flow into the mitochondria. And so AMP kinase is saturating and sending in the fat faster. Whereas to put the mice into torpor, they gave them a PPAR alpha activator and they fed them corn oil. And so you see, it's like, it's not just how fast it goes in, it's also how saturated it is. And there's just really interesting interplay and dynamics between all that. And it's hard to understand, but.
Yeah. And I think, at least from my perspective, what would come short is I can see flooding it causing reductive stress. But once, like we're talking about, like we go into like a hibernation type metabolism, it's no longer flooding in. It's all acetylated and it's all, I think of it as like a log jam.
Well, it is a log jam. And so, right. And interestingly, what happens is, so you can use the PPAR alpha activator to force to create initial reductive stress.
Yes.
But then when you're in reductive stress over time, your CPT levels drop and your PPAR alpha levels drop, and which is of course what happens once the animal's in hibernation, because once you get there, then it's like, okay, well, we're going to turn off that burning because we're trying to conserve our fat stores now for winter, right? And so torpor has all these different stages. It's sort of unclear which one we're in. We're sort of still hyperphagic, but we've also already downregulated.
Right. That's why in that study, when you mentioned the mice, I was just wondering if they like continue the PPAR. I call it PPAR alpha. Just that's how I've always read it. In my
sure.
head.
Yeah.
It's funny how people. If you keep that going, I would imagine like it would be hard for the mice to stay in hibernation if you keep pumping fat burning through them.
Yeah. Well, I think they stop once they actually. I think they just do it for like 2 weeks
to get it started.
But it puts them it puts them into torpor in the first place, Yeah. And it's a nice conversation. And then again, this guy Cody Smith at North Carolina, who I already mentioned, he just did a study. I think it was 2021 or even 2022 that came out where he took a mice. He must be thinking very much along the same lines as I am, because he did the study about NNT, and then his next study, he overexpressed PPAR alpha in mice, and the mice have like whole body reductive stress, and they're completely glucose intolerant. And then what he did was he took this is actually very interesting. He took catalase, which is another it's another what am I calling it? Antioxidant that the body makes, but usually it's only in peroxisomes. And so he made a construct so that he could overexpress catalase in the mitochondria of these mice. And so he made a version of this mice that's overexpressing PPAR alpha and catalase in the mitochondria. And so the thing about these mice was they had massive oxidative stress and they had signs of reductive stress. And so he was like, well, what's causing their problems? Is it the oxidative stress or is it the reductive stress ultimately that's driving the oxidative stress? And so using the catalase in the mitochondria, he was able to reverse the oxidative stress.
Interesting.
And it fixed some of their issues, but not all. They were still had severe reductive stress and I think glucose, they couldn't uptake glucose. They still had glucose issues and all these other issues. And that was just presumably from upregulating CPT1. And so there really is this idea that like you don't want, like, even though, right, you can also give humans that are diabetics clofibrate, which is a PPAR activator, and that has really beneficial effects on liver fat and other things. And so when you're fully in torpor, you probably aren't making enough PPAR alpha, but on the other hand, just stimulating a whole bunch of PPAR alpha sometimes can put you really into reductive stress. And so there's a balance there, right? You don't want to flood the engine. It's like hitting the dumb neighbor kid that would come over when I was trying to start my ATV, and he would just be like jamming the throttle. I mean, you can't jam the throttle, and it just floods the engine, right? So it's like there's a real complex dynamics happening there at the point of like how fast the fat should enter the mitochondria. And interestingly, last point on this, alpha linolenic acid, the omega-3, is a fairly potent PPAR alpha activator. And linoleic acid also activates PPAR alpha. So the PUFA are kind of like pushing their own throttle, and they're highly preferentially oxidized, right? They're highly, and and they're so highly oxidized that if you go to Google Scholar and you type carbon recycling and PUFA, what happens is when you eat, let's say you eat flaxseed oil, which is all alpha linolenic acid, which is an omega-3. It's the 18 carbon omega-3 polyunsaturated fat. Polyunsaturated fat, when we eat it, especially alpha linolenic acid, is immediately sent into the mitochondria, broken all the way down to acetyl-CoA, and then rebuilt into palmitic acid. Like, we literally break it all the way down and then we rebuild it into saturated fat. And that's what happens to 85% of it. 15% of it gets elongated into longer chain omega-3s or goes here or there. But almost all of it is like immediate, like within 5 minutes of consuming a bunch of it that's radio labeled, you can find radio labeled palmitic acid all over the body because it's stimulating PPAR alpha. It's actually preferentially grabbed by CPT1. It's flooding into the mitochondria. It's all being broken down to acetyl-CoA. So now you've created reductive stress just by eating a bunch of alpha linolenic acid. And so the reductive stress, the acetyl-CoA builds up, that kicks on de novo lipogenesis. And all of a sudden, the acetyl-CoA is being cranked back out as palmitic acid.
Saturated fat.
Right, and no other fat does that, and this is like, it's so funny because there's like 12 papers about this that all came out between like 98 and like 2006. And then like people just stopped talking about it entirely. And you're like, how does that happen? This is such an interesting topic. And like they did one study in humans and they were like, yep, it's true in humans. And then that was the last study ever done. You're like, but shouldn't there be ramification? I feel like we should be talking about this. This is a big deal, guys, but nobody.
Pass the torch to you, Brad.
I guess so.
This is yours.
Yeah. So now I'm talking about it. So yes, it turns out that we rapidly recycle polyunsaturated fat back into saturated fat, which is interesting on a lot of different levels, but mostly to me it's interesting because you can't, the only way, my understanding of how de novo lipogenesis works is the only way that's possible is if all of that is sent into the mitochondria, gets beta oxidized, and you essentially create reductive stress so that de novo lipogenesis kicks in and it starts cranking out, saturated fat to get rid of the reductive stress in the mitochondria.
Right.
That's my understanding of it works. And so I think that these vegetable oils acutely cause reductive stress. And sure, once they put you into full on torpor, then the dynamics change a little bit. And maybe at that point, it's a good idea to stimulate PPAR alpha, but it's a complex dynamic.
And one of the things I was researching a little bit after reading your blog was this idea that, we'll just say NAD plus is kind of like this limiting factor that's keeping us kind of torpor, and basically we need to get out of this, we need NAD plus. And I was like, well, what is causing, what depletes NAD plus? And it seems like CD38 is like a big kind of regulator of NAD plus levels.
Yes.
And I was like, what about CD838 inhibitors? But I say this because I kind of went down a CD838 rabbit hole. I'm like, this does a lot of different things.
It does.
So I'm not I don't know if we want to inhibit that. But
so no, I thought a lot about this myself, and so I actually have probably 2 articles from now coming up on the blog. I'm gonna again be talking about, so there's these things called obesogens, and the one thing that they all have in common, specifically, I'm talking about one called tributyltin, which was like a paint they used to put on the hulls of boats to keep barnacles off. And there's one called BPA, which is in plastic lined soup cans, and it's in most of our food. It's in the microplastics, which are literally apparently in our bloodstream.
Yep.
So there's BPA, which is obviously well known, and the other one is this one called dioxins. There's one called TCDD, but they're also the PCBs that are industrial runoff that are in the Hudson River. I know is a highly contaminated with PCBs. I'm sure the Great Lakes are. PCBs are in beef. They're in they get in the air from industrial smoke, and then they come down in the rain, and they're in the grass. They're kind of, they call them forever chemicals because their half-life is 500 years. And so they're in the atmosphere. They were all released during the Industrial Revolution, and now they're just kind of a ubiquitous part of life, right? That we all consume them and on some quantity.
Right.
And so anyway, so these things are all known obesogens. And what they all have in common is that they all trigger various of the nuclear receptor superfamily, which are things called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, which I've talked a lot on the blog. Bisphenol A triggers the steroid X receptor, and tributyltin triggers PPAR gamma. And interestingly, both PPAR gamma and the steroid X receptor both upregulate CD38 directly. And the aryl hydrocarbon receptor upregulates, I believe it's called PARP, which is another enzyme that the PARP is involved in DNA repair, but it's another enzyme that burns NAD plus. And so all of the obesogens are basically directly upregulating other enzymes that are competing for NAD plus.
Yeah.
And so interestingly, and the other thing I just found out that I haven't gone followed it more is that PPAR alpha indeed also upregulates a cytochrome, one of the cytochrome P450s, which are like involved in detoxification. But one of the things that they do is they oxidize vegetable oils.
Yeah, exactly.
And the oxidized vegetable oils in turn stimulate PPAR gamma. Yep. And so PPAR alpha itself, so PPAR alpha is stimulated by vegetable oils. It then goes out and upregulates the enzyme that oxidizes the vegetable oils, which then go out and stimulate PPAR gamma, which upregulates CD38. And so, you know, you see these weird interconnected loops happening. Yeah. But they all kind of end with downregulating NAD+. Like that's the commonality between the obesogens and vegetable oil.
Yep. And I mean, you bring up a good point is one of my questions I had to ask you about, kind of, because a lot of your work focuses on not like we're eating these vegetable oils, but not so there's some people that just think they're oxidized, and because we're eating oxidized vegetable oils that it's bad.
Right.
From I almost said from our perspective, your perspective is like you eat these independent if they were oxidized previously.
Right. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah. No, they're still bad. Like the fundamental problem with them is not that they're oxidized or that they oxidize. You know, the fundamental problem is that, well, they're, you know, animals know to eat them when they want to induce torpor, right? Like it's all built into just the unsaturation level. Like that's how we oxidize things, you know. And the whole thing, like I say, that I just stumbled across a couple of weeks ago, but when I find out things about the, you know, carbon recycling, and then the fact that you know, PPAR alpha upregulates cytochrome, you know, P450 number 4. You know, it just all, again, it's more positive feedback loops. And that's what I keep finding is like, okay, well, this is, you know, they're all adding together and the common denominator seems to be this regulation of NAD+. But
so when linoleic acid are, you know, we get oxidation, we get these oxalams, 9-hode, 13-hode, HNE.
Right.
These seem to be bad in other contexts. So we were kind of talking about metabolic health, obesity. It seems like this also bridges into other problems. Have you touched on, like, have you dug into those? Or you
know, I haven't that much. I mean, the extent to which I've dug into them is to the extent that I'm interested in. So, all of these things, I mean, maybe not 4-HNE. You know, Tucker Goodrich has done a ton of work on 4-HNE. Yep. So, you know, he's probably the best source of information on that subject. But what I'm really interested about them is vegetable oils do oxidize on their own. There's an auto-oxidation thing that happens, right? But when we're talking about things like 9-hode and 15 heat, all of these oxylipins, I guess, would be the broad category. You know, all those things are all specifically made with enzymes, right? And those enzymes are controlled mostly by things in the nuclear receptor superfamily. So they're controlled by things like the aryl hydrocarbon receptor and the steroid X receptor and PPAR alpha and PPAR gamma. And, you know, there's a whole bunch of them.
Yep.
The liver X receptor and the retinoid X receptor. And, you know, there's like 20 of them or 25 of them. I can't even name them all. And those things, and NRF2. So interestingly, all of these enzymes, especially the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, NRF2, and there's another one that I'm spacing on, maybe the steroid X receptor, are all involved in detoxification broadly. And so, you know, the reason that the so the reason that the aryl hydrocarbon receptor is upregulated by dioxins is that their hydrocarbon receptor upregulates all of these enzymes that can oxidize the dioxins and break them down and get rid of them.
Yep.
Right. And so it's the job of these enzymes to kind of keep us safe from environmental toxins. Yep. Right. And so that's why they exist. But one of the things that they also do is they oxidize the vegetable oils. Yep. And then that's right. And so now you're in another positive feedback loop, because the vegetable oils are, once they get oxidized, they're now activators of PPAR gamma, which is itself a nuclear receptor superfamily member. And the PPAR gamma is probably upregulating its own cytochromes, and, the cycle just keeps repeating itself. And again, and they're all stealing NAD plus. And so, to me, I think there are a lot of people who are thinking about vegetable oil and just going, oh, well, it's oxidizing all the time. And that is true. But a lot of the specific, oxidized compounds of the vegetable oil that you see in the body are actually, your enzymes
doing it.
Did that. They're doing it, and they're doing it in a very controlled way as part of this larger system.
Yep.
And one of the effects of that system is it's stealing your NAD plus. So,
Exactly.
Yeah.
So one thing I got to talk to you about, and I want to be respectful of your time, but I got to talk to you about the China study, Diet, Lifestyles, and Mortality in China in 1983. You turned me on to this, and to me, I'm going through the data.
It's a fascinating coffee table book, isn't it?
Oh, well, it's monstrous. But it's so fascinating because we don't need to go all into the calorie in, calorie out versus XYZ, but you see statistics and ones that you highlighted on the blog, Nanan versus who I'm going to say these countries.
Yeah, I don't know what they are either.
Okay, Nanan eating almost 3,600 calories. These are 122-pound Chinese.
Yeah.
Huan eating 1,800 calories, 125-pound Chinese.
Yeah.
One thing I wish was clear was, first of all, 3,600 calories is a lot. Myself, I don't eat anywhere near that, and I'm 160 pounds.
Oh yeah.
I'm probably taller than them, but regardless, these discrepancies are gigantic.
Oh yeah.
And the one thing that the quote that you pull out, the least active Chinese consumed 30% more calories than their average American counterparts, yet weighed 20% less. The excess calories are lost as heat rather than stored as fat. Like, to me, that's like the conclusion of like the problem.
Right. And so when you look at those people, they have, and this is true of, and I've written a lot about this in the blog, as you probably know, but this is true of all societies that live almost entirely on starch. I talked about one in a very recent article about metabolic rate. I think it was in response to Herman Ponzer's burn. And
it's a great post. Yep.
Yeah. And so they went to Thailand and they did a dietary analysis, and it was like 86% of their calories were carbohydrate calories. I mean, it was 84%, and fat was like 6%, and protein was, 15 or 12 or whatever the difference, And so, that is, a lot of people around the world eat just that diet, just white rice basically, or just, whatever the local starch is, just manioc, right? And the tsimani in Bolivia is another example of this. They're just eating starch. They're eating plantains and manioc, right? And so you've got these Thai rice farmers, and you've got these people in the Amazon, and they're all just eating starch, and they have these extraordinarily high metabolic rates. I mean, the female Thai rice farmers, it's the highest metabolic rate that I've ever seen measured in any group of humans, right? When they adjusted for lean body mass.
Right.
And then when you look at the body fat composition of these starch eating peoples, it's very saturated. Yep. So, ironically, the thing about eating meat is that meat has a lot of monounsaturated fat in it, and even a fair amount of polyunsaturated fat, depending on what the meat is. And so the effect of eating meat, right, which we've been told is like, it's bad because it's so much saturated fat. But the effect of eating the meat is that your body fat becomes less saturated. And that's like the great irony that like, right. I sort of like don't want to say it out loud because I'm like, this is going to make people's heads explode.
Right.
But it's true, right? Like starch eaters, at least if your mother was a starch eater and she was healthy and you were born into that culture and your metabolism is set up right, and you've eaten starch your whole life, you're going to have an extraordinarily high metabolic rate.
Yep.
Americans have never had as high a metabolic rate as, these rice eating people in Thailand. And our fat has always been less saturated than them. And what's funny is that the paper that I use on my blog to point this out was done in like 1962, and they went to a tribe, a couple tribes in somewhere in Africa, and I can't remember exactly where. And they were eating I think they were eating sorghum. There was one tribe that was eating sorghum, and which is like a relatively oily grain, kind of like corn.
Yep. And
there was another tribe, but low in overall fat. It's like very low compared to any American diet. And there was another group that was eating more like starchy tubers, which has almost no fat in it, right? Yep. And so they took the body fat from those two people, and they took body fat from Americans, and maybe that was it. I don't remember. I feel like there was one other group, but anyway, and so the African, that were eating starch had much more saturated fat than the Americans did. And they had the high metabolic rate to go with it, the whole thing. And so, but what I was going to say, why that's ironic is that that study was done by, I think it was Fred Stair, and he's one of the initial guys. I apologize if I have the name wrong. He's one of the main guys that, along with Ansel Keys, was pushing the idea that we should all be eating more vegetable oil, right? Because there's too much saturated fat. At the same time, they did this research showing that Americans already had much less saturated fat than these other healthy tribesmen. And so they knew from the beginning that our fat was less saturated. And they were like, we need to make it even more unsaturated. And you're just like, why?
And these examples are like perfect for me. So the carbohydrate insulin model, Gary Taubes, where carbs are bad because of insulin. But this to me is like, this is why that model really breaks down here. Because we see these people that are not obese eating high amounts of carbohydrate. Now, I could make an argument that's not the healthiest diet, but if we're just talking about obesity,
sure, totally,
high carbohydrate diet, like you said, pure starch with 20% fish or meat or 15% fish and meat, like these are lean people with high metabolic rates.
Absolutely. And I don't necessarily want to eat that diet, and nor, like you say, I don't think it's an ideal diet from a health perspective. But yeah, if your interest is metabolic rate, like bam, there's the way to go. But the problem is, if I do that, I know that I have upregulated SCD1 because I've done, I did the omega quant test of my blood ratios. You can just test it and you're like, yep, I definitely have I have elevated SCD1. And so, you have to deal with that before you can go back to eating, whatever.
Should we talk about how to deal with it? Because I have there's one thing when I was reading your blog that seemed like the elephant in the room. And so there's a few things. One is this was a perfect time to mention because you mentioned you eat animals. They are high in monounsaturated fats, saturated fats, and depending on the animal, could be high in polyunsaturated fats. And for listeners that don't know, Brad, you make low polyunsaturated fat pork, right?
Yes.
So we might as well plug that now because it's a good
Yeah.
segue.
Right. So I have a company called Firebrand Meats. And so one of the reasons that I started thinking about all this is that in my previous life, I ran a pastured pig farm, and I had a all grass fed butcher shop in Ithaca, New York. And what I noticed raising the pigs here, I read a lot of literature about kind of a nerd. I like doing research. If you hadn't picked that up, but I would read all these old. They had all these great old swine science books from like 1886 to like 1930. There's a lot of really great research was being done about different ways to like, if you give them pasture, but you feed them, whatever, apples. Let's see, and how much weight do they gain? Is it efficient? Does it work? So they do all this crazy old research, and it's interesting, and nobody does that kind of research anymore. Right. So it was really interesting to read those old papers, and they have problems. Like they didn't understand like limiting amino acids. There was all kinds of stuff they didn't understand back then. So the experiments are flawed, but they're fascinating. And so I was reading all those things, but what you come across is like, it was sort of well known that certain feeds caused soft pork. One of them was chufas or chuffas. I don't know how you say it. CHUFA. And this is a sedge that grows in the South, and it grows a little tuber underground, and pigs love them. And so you can grow this field of these tubers, and you turn the pigs in, and they dig them up, and they eat them, and they get fat. But it says the fat is soft. Well, it turns out that chufas are high in linoleic acid. And so, they knew you could feed them peanuts, but that the pork would be soft. Mm-hmm. And then you read and it says, well, American pigs sold at a discount, or, American bacon sold at a discount in European markets because the pork was soft. And again, it's because Europeans back then finished their pigs on barley, and Americans finished our pigs on corn, and corn has about twice the oil that barley does. And so so there's all this great old research. And so then I started raising pigs, and I started noticing that like I really could change the firmness of my fat based on what I fed the pigs and based on the breed of the pigs. Mm-hmm. And so I really, and I developed a habit, or, probably a psychosis of like, every time I go into a meat room, where like pigs are hanging from the rail and getting ready to get cut up in a butcher shop somewhere, I immediately just start poking the back fat to see how firm it is. Like I can't help myself. Like, even if I don't even know whose pigs they are, and I find myself in a lot of meat rooms. So, anyway, but so very quickly I started to see like, wow, makes such a big difference, what you feed them and how it accumulates, and the genetics, right? The genetics makes it, like, for a little while I couldn't get the pigs I wanted. So I was buying these more modern lean genetics pigs, the long pink pigs. Yep. And those pigs, no matter what I did, I could not get them to have firm back fat. It didn't matter. I raised them in the same field, same feed, same everything as these like mealfoot crosses I was growing. And like, the fat just never got firm ever. Didn't matter what I did. And so I was seeing this interaction of genetics and feeds, and, my only real thing was just feeling the firmness ultimately in the cold room. And then eventually I sent in some for testing, and I found out it only had 6% polyunsaturated fat. And I knew that, commercial, according to the USDA, commercial pig fat is like more like 10, 11% linoleic acid. And so I was at about half that. So I'm like, that's cool. And so anyway, I don't have that company anymore, but I have a new company called Firebrand Meats. And I'm using a lot of those lessons that has sort of informed my research and my thinking about things as I've researched. But now we're making pork again. I'm not growing it here. I have a guy, but he's great. He's like a 5th generation pig farmer. He's brilliant. He's a much better pig farmer than I ever was. And we're actually using, this is ironic and a lot of people are amused by it. To me, it's just a good feed for what I want to do, but they make, they grow peas. So peas are another traditional feed that they used in Northern Europe and in Canada. Canada was also really known for having firm pork fat, and they also fed barley and peas. And so it's just the north. Corn doesn't grow as well farther north, so people grow barley and peas. Anyway, but peas are really low in oil too. And so they grow peas for things like the Impossible Burger, and they go to like a factory in the Midwest and they take out the pea protein. So they make like a pea protein isolate, and that's what the like vegan things are made out of, is pea protein isolate. But that leaves the starch from the peas as like a powder. And so the guy who grows the pigs for me has a contract for this pea flour, which is basically totally fat-free, that we get from these big processing facilities in the Midwest. And that's one of the main components of the diets that we feed the pigs, so that we can be sure that we're not feeding them any linoleic acid. And so I've gotten that tested. I recently did a test. I sent in some fat from Smithfield pork that I rendered, and some of my stuff from Firebrand Meats. And that's all at firebrandmeats.com. And my lard was at 6% linoleic acid, and the Smithfield stuff was at 16% or 17%.
Yeah. And
my stearic acid was around 14%, and theirs was at like 9%. So, you know, you really can shift the entire ratio. And the other thing I'm using is I'm using Berkshire pigs. And one of the reasons I'm using Berkshire pigs is that so most fatty breeds of pigs put on a lot of oleic acid, monounsaturated fat, right? And partly that's because they have upregulated SCD1, and that's why they get fat in the first place, right? See, so it's all consistent, right? So they make a lot of SCD1, and therefore they make a lot of monounsaturated fat. For some reason, I don't know what it is, Berkshire is an old-fashioned breed of pig. They have great marbling, like dark meat color. It's awesome pork. But for whatever reason, they don't make a lot of monounsaturated fat. And so I need to pull that study back out again that I did. But my Berkshire pork is going to be lower in monounsaturated fat than probably most any other pork out there as well. So I advertise it as low in polyunsaturated fat, but really it's low in overall unsaturated fats and higher in saturated fats than any other pork out there. High in stearic acid, yeah, and it's probably higher in palmitic acid too. And so that's, obviously that's what I'm going for.
That's awesome. I mean, you're making bacon great again.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying.
You can have that as a slogan.
Yeah, that's right. That's pretty good. I like that. Yeah. So that's what I'm doing over at Firebrand Meats. Yeah. So that's one of the things. So, right. So obviously, the first thing is to change your diet, like stop eating unsaturated fats. And that is right. And so then you get into it's so funny. It's like the things that I'm arguing, I feel like are like so extraordinarily controversial because I mean, the first thing I did, first big article that I wrote, of course, was the croissant diet. And as I was writing it, I was just laughing to myself because I was like, this is just going to piss off everyone. It's going to piss off the vegan, or it's going to piss off vegans. It's going to piss off carnivores. It's going to piss off people who are keto. It's going to, piss off people who like olive oil, Mediterranean diet, like everyone.
Everyone but the French.
French chefs.
The French are going to love you. I love the design of it. The design was so good because, I mean, you were controlling for variables. Like you couldn't put the benefit to ketosis, so it's like. Right.
Well, yeah. That's exactly what I wanted to do. But yeah.
Right. There was one question I had about your design of that diet. And knowing you were a student of the China study, more specifically the data, why flour and not a different starch? As flour, from maybe it was even one of your posts, is I think in the China study, the most correlated food with cardiovascular disease.
So that's true. That's true. However, if you look, it's pretty much flat up until about, I want to say like 400 grams a day, and then it inflects upwards. So it's like the flour in the China health study to me looks, safe up to a point. And if you eat just flour, then yeah, it's not a good idea. Agreed. No, absolutely. Flour is absolutely the thing. Wheat flour in the China health study has the highest correlation with heart disease. No doubt. But I think that's, that was people that are literally eating like
tons, dose dependent,
85% of their calories from wheat noodles. Right. And I think there is a dose curve thing there. But ultimately, to answer the real answer to the question, of course, is that so the thing that, when I first started thinking about all this, the thing that was most strongly in my head was the idea that, okay, I knew that the Chinese diet of just white rice worked for them. And I knew that, the keto diet worked for a lot of people. And so, and I knew that the American diet of, flour with vegetable oil doesn't work. But I also knew that the traditional French and American diets did work for a very long time. And those diets combined flour and potatoes, sugar, with butter and cream and beef and pork. And so...
And pretty high sugar, which you didn't know.
And pretty high sugar. And so, and when I did the croissant diet, I was using, for a while instead of croissants, I was making pancakes and I was putting maple syrup on them because, well, the French did and the American did.
And so you did that too, because that's a segue into the Native American discussion. But yeah, sorry.
Totally. And so, so what I really wanted to understand was what is the difference? What is the difference between the American diet now and the traditional American diet or the traditional French diet, which have the same macros, right? The same macros. The only thing that's different is the type of fat that we use. And it's not like, people talk about glycemic load and glycemic index. It's like the French and Americans have been eating white sugar and white flour since the 1850.
Yep. And
obesity was not a problem until, I don't know, 1970 or 1980.
Really?
Right? So for like 100 years, it was fine until vegetable oils went over, 200 calories a day or something. And that's when everything goes haywire. And so I was like, there's got to be something different about the composition of those two fats. It's the only thing that's changed.
Right. It was something like sunflower oil, like 3X or something like that, where the French in the 70s to the French today, like you're saying, the macros are roughly the same.
Yeah.
The foods are roughly the same besides, I think it was sunflower oil.
So sunflower oil, yeah.
Did like a 3X increase and now they're obese like Americans.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's super interesting. That made me think maple syrup. This is the one thing that you talked about. Native Americans did seem to appear to get obese on very high amounts of maple syrup, which initially when I read that, I was like, this invalidates the thesis because high carb. But yeah, I know that we're going to go with the SCD1 and insulin, right? With this.
Right.
Because my initial reaction was like, high carb makes sense. SCD1 should actually go up to desaturate the carbohydrate, because if we're getting all saturated fat, we're getting all carbs, de novo lipogenesis, saturated fat, we need SCD1 to desaturate that to maintain the balance.
Right.
But you were going to say that because of insulin, right?
Well, so what happens is, for whatever reason, and I'm not going to pretend that I know the answer right now. First off, I want to make a minor correction that the Native Americans did not eat maple syrup, they ate maple sugar.
Oh, thank you. You probably had that right.
Which just means that they boil it a little bit longer until it crystallizes. So it's a crystal rather than a syrup. Anyway, very minor point. But to answer your question, for some reason, diets that are very high in sugar, but like very high in sugar, such as only maple sugar, dramatically increase SCD1. I don't really know why that is, but they've shown it in mice in the lab. If you feed them tons and tons and tons of sugar, you also get like a 10x spike in SCD1. And so, yeah, so in talking about the Native Americans who eat the sugar, I was making a parallel between, the mechanism is the same, which is this increase in SCD1.
Right.
You can get there by either eating vegetable oil or by eating just sugar. Probably combining vegetable oil and sugar is a bad idea.
This is maybe an experiment I'll run on myself, because I think the Hadza, I mean, they get a lot of attention now, but they at times eat very high amounts of honey. I think I've like up to 60% or something like crazy.
Right. No, it's high.
I'm like, whoa, that's actually super high. But because it's honey, there's a lot of fructose, so maybe the insulin isn't as exaggerated. So maybe the SCD1 is not as upregulated in that context. Yeah,
and I think it's, obviously it's multifaceted, and one of the things, so this was a conversation I had on Twitter recently, and I didn't really follow up with it, but one of the things you see when you look at, Hadza don't have particularly high metabolic rates.
That's true. Yeah.
And so everybody thinks the Hadza should have high metabolic rates. And so Herman Poncer went there and he measured their metabolic rates, and they didn't have, they measured their entire energy expenditure over, 10 days or something. And they had the same energy expenditure as Americans do. And everyone was like shocked by this.
Exactly.
And to the point that that someone like Poncer, who did the experiment, now, I mean, I just read his book, and he kind of throws up his hands and says, well, there's no, like, all metabolic rates are the same, because I expected the Hadza to be high because I had certain ideas that, metabolic rate is primarily controlled by how much exercise that you get. And so therefore I expect the Hadza who walk a lot to have extraordinarily high metabolic rate, and they didn't. And he says, therefore you can't change your metabolic rate, sort of thing. And I'm like, okay, but my expectations about what should make a higher metabolic rate are completely different than Poncer's, right? Like, I'm thinking like, okay, if I want to find a high metabolic rate, I'm going to go to Thailand. I'm going to find a culture that eats pure starch. I'm not necessarily going to look for people who exercise a lot, because I don't think that makes much difference. And if you read Poncer's book, he says, yep, exercise doesn't make any difference to your overall caloric burn. And I'm like, that would be exactly my expectation. I'm like, if you want to find metabolic rates, you need to look for the people with the most saturated fat. And the Hadza, who are eating a bunch of honey, are not going to have it, right? You're looking in the wrong place. Yeah. So like, that is like completely lost on, there's a whole like, there's a whole other thought, of course, I'm sure you're aware of them, who are like just pure calories in, calories out people. And to them, even the suggestion that, eating pure starch and having more saturated fat changes your metabolic rate is like heresy.
It is heresy.
They all know that you can't change your metabolic rate because because Poncer measured the Hadza and it didn't change, and therefore any suggestion that metabolic rate can be different is hogwash, which to me is very reductive logic.
It is. I think the energy balance model is correct in that the energy is conserved, but
the energy is conserved.
But it is getting burned. Like, I think you make a great argument. Like, we have this increased thermogenesis. The metabolic rate changes. You eat more, metabolic rate goes up, or like you're saying, the saturated fat, which is controlling the metabolic rate. Like, the energy is conserved in the energy balance model, but what happens with that energy is what is different.
Right. Exactly. And anyway, well, here's what I was going to say, though. I think the other piece of this is one of the main things. The other thing that happens with metabolic rate is the best way to increase your metabolic. If you really want to increase your metabolic rate, all you have to do is eat more. Exactly. And if you really want to decrease your metabolic rate, all you have to do is eat less. It works every time. And so, to a large extent, I think that metabolic rate is actually supply driven. So, like, if you eat a bunch more, you're going to have a higher metabolic rate. And so, and the converse is true. And so, if you go look at like tribes in Africa that have been through a drought or for whatever reason have been having bad crop seasons or are just in a place where the weather's lousy and they just can't grow enough per acre or whatever, and so they have limited caloric intake, they inevitably have a low metabolic rate, even if they're eating pure starch and their diet matches the people that I would argue should have the highest metabolic rates. But if calories are limited, they're going to have a low metabolic rate. And so for that reason, metabolic rate is somewhat supply driven. And so another reason that the Hadza might have a low metabolic rate is simply that, they're going to work reasonably hard to get the calories that they can. Yep. But they're probably never going to have the same access to calories as, a Thai rice farmer who's in a rainy climate, who can probably put up bumper crops every year, and they essentially have an unlimited supply of calories. Yep. And so they're going to eat more, and that's going to push their metabolic rate higher, which is what should happen, right? Like, if you eat more calories, your metabolic rate should go up. And I actually have been reading, there's a series of fascinating articles done in this maybe early 80s, maybe late 70s to early 80s of this, the Guru Walla, it's called, I think, Guruwalla, something like that. There's a tribe in Africa where, for the men would do this when they were like 18. It was kind of as a display of their wealth and their rank. They would basically go through this fattening procedure where they would eat like 10,000 calories. I mean, this one guy that they studied, they said was literally eating like 12,500 calories every day. And the goal is to fatten up so that you can show that you're from wealth and stature, and then you get a wife, right?
Yep.
And so anyway, when you look at the amount of calories these guys are like, so they're eating 12, you're like, okay, well, if you do the math and you're like, well, 3,500 calories should add a pound of fat, right? So in theory, if you're eating 12,000 calories every day, you should be adding on like 4 pounds of fat. Well, in reality, he was adding like 100 grams of fat a day, which is like a quarter of a pound. Yeah. You know what I mean? Or maybe it was 200 grams, but it was, somewhere in there, it was like 6,000 calories was just magically disappearing every day. And it's like, where does it go? And then, of course, after this one guy had done this, these fattenings go on for like 6 months. And I think this one guy had like done one and then immediately gone into a second one. So he'd been doing it for like 9 months of this just like intentional, massive overeating. And then, they went back for a follow-up. And I think it was like 3 years later. And the guy was literally back to exactly his starting weight before, like he was like within a kilogram of his starting weight before starting this massive fattening. And so, I mean, he did gain, you know, what, I don't know, 30 kilograms or something.
Yeah.
But then as soon as he stopped intentionally overeating, it just all came off. And of course, he wasn't eating any vegetable oil. The foods were like a sorghum bread and whole milk, basically. That was what, there was some kind of porridge too, but it was, I think it was all made from this sorghum. It was all sorghum and milk, basically, or sorghum and dairy. And so it's all either starch or it's saturated fat. And, you know, your metabolic rate will change based on how many calories you eat.
Yep.
But obviously that has stopped happening in America. But that's how it should work in a healthy,
in a non-hibernating metabolism.
Right. Exactly. It shouldn't be how it is now.
Right.
In America. Right. It's not, something's wrong.
So I think this is probably a good place to be like, we're hibernating metabolisms, solutions to getting out. You have, well, I think of it as kind of two ways. We talked about like the ROS theory, which is like, we want to create ROS. So you have stearic acid, long chain, 18 carbon, saturated fat, where you have a butter where you basically, you eat straight stearic acid and you put it like in coffee or something, it turns into like a wax and it's hard to eat. So
it's hard to eat.
You melt it into like a butter so you can increase stearic acid content. Believe me, I've done some of these experiments on myself.
Yeah.
Then the other side of the equation is SCD1, which there's various things you can do to try and like different kind of herbal things, prescription things like metformin, various things that will decrease SCD1. So we're pulling these kind of two levers.
Right.
Exactly. You have a number of like products on your website that help pull both these levers, right? Right.
I do. And so I sell, like you say, the powdered stearic acid, which is just you can use it in a lot of things. I mean, I've heard of some people just blend it into like a smoothie and eat it that way. And it's kind of weird. It's like a little bit gritty, but people say they've gotten good results from it. So like, I'm not going to knock it. No. So that's right. And the stearic acid is it's the longest chain saturated fat. It's going to drive the most ROS production. And it maybe is special. It's called the banana milkshake study, but people put stearic acid into, well, basically a banana milkshake and they went on like a low fat vegan diet for 2 days and they took blood from the people and they stained the white blood cell of the cell so you can see the mitochondria. And after the 2 days of the vegan diet, the mitochondria are, what do I want to say? They're broken up into like small little distinct balls. And then they have the banana shake with all the stearic acid. And then like 6 hours later, all of their mitochondria have like fused into these long webs of mitochondria, which is apparently what mitochondria do when they're actively burning fat and generating a lot of ROS. They make these like long networks of mitochondria. So it's a cool study because the visual picture of the mitochondria is stunning, but it also shows that in actual, walking around humans, stearic acid does make this, very specific difference within a matter of hours, Yeah. So that's really cool. I have the stearic acid for sale. If you just Google the banana milkshake study, I think you'll find my blog article about that paper.
Which is a good article.
Yeah. So that's the banana milkshake study. Yes. And so then I have the, something called sterculia oil, which is interesting, right? So this is from a tropical nut. And it just so happens that one of the fats in it has this, it's basically just a saturated fat, but it has this ring structure right where the active site of SCD1 is. And so a little bit of that, when the SCD1 tries to desaturate it, it can't get in there and do it. And so it ends up blocking the SCD1. It appears to be pretty safe. You know, these nuts are eaten regularly in India. If you search for sterculia nuts, you know, for sale at market on YouTube, you can find videos of like, you know, farmers markets with people selling these nuts in Indian markets. There's videos of people like there's one where there's like a tree and it's in front of like a courthouse, and the guy's like, look, here's how you use sterculia nut, and he walks open and cracks them open and peels it and eats it, you know. So these are normal. This tree grows all over the tropics. It grows in Mexico. It grows through, you know, tropical, Americas, Africa, Asia, everywhere, basically. It's widely consumed as a human food, so I think the safety profile is good, and it is interestingly that like little ring structure, even though it's totally saturated, it has a texture like a vegetable oil, even though there's almost no polyunsaturated fat in it, or really very little unsaturated fat at all. It's mostly the cyclopropene fat. Anyway, so that is another way. It is a totally natural, you know, inhibitor of the enzyme SCD1, which I think we're all making too much of. Well, maybe not all of us, but many of us are making too much of. And then I also introduced something called succinate. So this is a natural succinate supplement. And so the reason, you know, we briefly touched on the mitochondrial bottleneck. So what happens in the mitochondria is electrons are entering the electron transport chain, both from complex 1 and complex 2. And the amount of electrons that come back out through reverse electron flow and form superoxide is controlled by how many electrons are entering through complex 2. And so complex 2 really creates that bottleneck and controls how much superoxide is being produced. And so succinate enters its electrons directly into complex 2. So succinate is sort of a water-soluble option that has the same mechanism of action of stearic acid, which is to increasing that flow through complex 2 to generate superoxide. It's going to be a little different primarily because succinate is going to be absorbed into different tissues than the stearic acid is. In mouse studies, people have only tried, and I don't even really know why they started doing it, but they've only tried succinate supplementation in the last 4 or 5 years. There's been a growing number of studies where they're giving succinate to these mice, and the results are unbelievable. Rapid weight loss. So another physiological thing that happens if you're obese is that your muscle fibers switch to this type called glycolytic. So you have there's all these different muscle fiber types. Some of them use a lot of oxygen and some of them do not. And there's a type 2B fiber and a type 2A. I forget exactly which ones they are. But mostly in obese people, you have the type of muscle fiber that doesn't use a lot of oxygen. It's mostly just doing, they call them slow twitch fibers. They're not the best. Whereas something about eating succinate, when they feed these mice succinate, it literally switches their muscle fibers over to, I think it's type 2A, which is the type that is fast twitch and burns oxygen, but it also can do glycolytic. It's like a really banging muscle type that you probably want. Yeah. And I'm doing a bad job of explaining it because I can't actually remember the details myself. But so that's one of the things that happen is they have this conversion of their actual muscle fibers. Like I say, they lose weight, their metabolic rate goes up. All of the things that we talk about should happen, you actually see happen in the mice when you feed them succinate. And so succinate's a weird, it's I think the dose you need was too big to, I mean, if you put it into capsules, you'd have to take like 12 of them. And so it's water soluble. So
Yep.
it kind of has a funny bitter taste, and the succinate itself is very sour. So I kind of made it into this like lemonade-y kind of drink. It doesn't taste great, but it doesn't taste horrible.
It's worth it for fat loss and good muscle.
Yeah, I just chug it down in the morning, and it's great. You know, I don't know if it's great, but it's fine. Yeah, you put in about 8 ounces scoop and like 8 ounces of water and shoot that 2 or 3 times a day. Is probably what you want to do there. And so that's kind of the latest thing. And the other thing I've been talking about on my blog a lot, and this is very interesting, is something called alpha lipoic acid. So alpha lipoic acid is a common-ish supplement. It's been on the market forever. People have known
various things. Yeah.
And it's very funny to me because I started thinking about it because people kept using it as an antioxidant, like in all these different trials. People would be like, well, you know, we tried this and we compared it to the antioxidant alpha lipoic acid. So I wasn't terribly interested in adding antioxidants, but every time when they used alpha lipoic acid as the control, the alpha lipoic acid just had these great results.
Right.
And finally I was like, what is going on with this stuff? I'm like, how can to me, it does not make sense that an antioxidant should have any of the effects that I'm seeing with this stuff, right? But I keep seeing it time and again. And so I started looking into it, and it turns out that what the alpha lipoic acid does is it actually, so one, we make alpha lipoic acid, and it's a cofactor for some of the most crucial enzymes in the TCA cycle, such as pyruvate dehydrogenase, which is a crucial enzyme. And so it doesn't work without lipoic acid. So, but more to the point, when you eat it, it gets fairly rapidly, it's well absorbed into most of the tissues of the body. And the R version of it goes into the nucleus, and the other version goes into the cytoplasm. And then both of them get rapidly oxidized by NADH. And the NADH gets oxidized back to NAD+, and then within an hour or two, the lipoic acid just gets broken down, and it gets released secreted into the urine. Yep. And so it kind of has this very short half-life, but it's basically oxidizing NADH back to NAD+. And so it's sort of directly giving you NAD+ back.
It can give you your leptin sensitivity back.
Yeah, exactly. And so so it's great. And I'm just kind of starting. I've been using it for a couple of weeks, and I've kind of been upping my dose a little bit. I started with a little bit, and I'm hoping that this gives me pretty continued weight loss. So we'll see. Jury's still out on that. Or maybe, and I've considered, and I have also, there's another, just talking about things that I've thought about that I haven't necessarily tried, but they're things people can try if they want to think about some other supplements. There's one called apigenin or apigenin. I don't know how you say it, but it's APIGENIN. It comes from those little flowers that people make tea out of, chamomile. I think it comes from chamomile blossoms. Anyway,
parsley.
Parsley, right?
I knew I had this written down.
Because and so what it does is exactly what you suggested. Is it inhibits CD38, and so it stops CD38 from stealing your NAD+. So it could work in conjunction with something like, really any of the other supplements, alpha lipoic acid or stearic acid or whatever. They're all like I said, the common denominator in all of these things really is generating NAD+.
Right.
And so that's another way to do it, right? Is to block CD38. And there's a couple other ones. My concern with So apigenin is a flavone or a flavone, whatever it's called, I think. My concern with the flavones, and I don't know if this is true with apigenin, but there was a study I was looking at in with a citrus flavone, and it was inhibiting certain enzymes that use NAD plus. Like I think the reason that it blocks CD38 is I think that it is shaped kind of like NAD plus, but I think that might also interfere with other parts of NAD plus metabolism. Yeah. So even though it's shown good results, like in a lab in mice, that's my concern with some of these flavones. Like I think quercetin also blocks CD38.
Quercetin, dill.
But that's my concern with those flavones is I feel like they may have other effects with NAD plus metabolism. So I'm like, I'm on the fence about them. They might be great. I don't know.
That's so funny. Reading your blog has trained my brain to go in the same direction as yours. Because I was like, hey, have we tried these CD38 inhibitors, apigenin, quercetin, which parsley, dill, and red onion, which I have not experimented with myself, but I wanted to though.
yeah, totally, right. And so and obviously, like these are things that people eat. I mean, chamomile, parsley.
I feel like is relatively safe on the safety spectrum.
Right, you'd think so, right? And so that's something you could do. This is a very interesting one, and I actually got this from the Cody Smith paper. So when he was doing his experiment with NNT to show, how NNT, is recycling all the NAD plus and how that's controlling the metabolic rate of the cell. He was titrating with to get the maximum metabolic rate of the cell. He was titrating with carnitine, L-carnitine. And it turns out that one of the things that L-carnitine does, L-carnitine is necessary to bring fat into the cell. So you have this triglyceride, and then it becomes an acyl carnitine when it gets transferred through the mitochondrial membrane, and then when it gets to the inside, it's transferred to the L-carnitine gets replaced with CoA, and it becomes an acyl CoA. That goes into the mitochondria, and the acyl CoA becomes acetyl CoA, and the acetyl CoA is what gets burned in the TCA cycle. But it turns out if there's extra carnitine around, what it does is it pulls, it replaces the CoA groups on the acetyl CoA. It converts them back to acetyl carnitine, and the acetyl carnitine gets sequestered back into the cytoplasm. And so it's basically, when I was talking about one of the problems with like polyunsaturated fats is you get this buildup of acetyl CoA in the mitochondria. The carnitine can help actually pull some of the extra fuel out of the furnace to try to get the air mixture right and get the furnace burning more cleanly.
Right.
So that's another interesting one.
That is interesting.
That could be worth trying. And it's had pretty good success in clinical trials. Nothing that's like on its own, it's not a grand slam. It's like a single or a double, it's pretty good, but you haven't won the game yet, but you're like, well, they've had some success with it, And I think the same thing is true of alpha lipoic acid. When you look at it at weight loss trials, people have on average lost weight with it, but it's like, it's like 2 kilograms or something, it's not like people have lost 40 pounds just with alpha lipoic acid. But again, there's like a lot of things that are kind of like pointing in the right direction, and maybe we just need to figure out like which three all kind of work together to create the desired end result.
Hibernating. This one's shaking you. 2 hands really shaking you.
Right. Yeah.
3 is like, all right, we're waking you up out of hibernation.
Yeah, exactly. So, So I mean, it's fun, and obviously there's a lot of different. There's always new things that pop up, and sometimes I'm like, oh, that's interesting, and a lot, 9 times out of 10, I'm like, yeah, no, that's a bad idea.
Yeah.
And they all, I'm sort of, for a while, I was very interested in things that upregulated NRF2. I've gone away from that direction a little bit for a couple of reasons. One is that NRF2 interacts with all of those, the aryl hydrocarbon. So NRF2 can upregulate the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, right, which in turn can upregulate SCD1 and like all the bad things, oxidize the PUFA. And the other one is I see now that the that upregulation of NRF2 can be associated with, you know, rising overall pool of glutathione, which to me starts to look like reductive stress.
Exactly.
So I'm on the fence about it because certainly, you know, having more UCP3 is not a bad thing. No. But, you know, I'm more interested in like maximizing the NNT system and getting my enzymes deacetylated, I think, before I'm worried about UCP3.
It almost seems like that would be a natural consequence. If you get all this deacetylated, we get everything running as it should. We have all this energy. We got to get rid of it. Okay. How are we going to get rid of it? Thermogenesis, maybe more energy, like non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So you're active, you're hot, you're energetic. So
yeah, exactly.
So my one big question I had for you is, and you haven't suggested this anywhere on the blog, but when I read everything, and this is the experiment I want to do. I want to take everyone obese, torpor, high SCD1, and lower metabolic rate. Basically, they're stuck. And this is not a fun experiment for them, but I'll call it crash diet. I want to diet them down to lean. Okay, no more obesity. And then I'll have a couple arms, a starch eating arm, so starch.
Right, sure.
Then another arm, basically carnivore diet, ruminants.
Right.
So very low PUFA, but also low carbohydrate, low insulin.
Right.
And then we can have a third control arm where they can just go eat ad libs, but standard American diet. My big question is, if we lose all the body fat, basically get all the PUFA out of the body fat,
right,
will SCD1 just naturally come down? So then you can eat ad lib non-PUFA foods like the high starch or like the high starch diet of the Chinese and be good.
Absolutely.
Or is SCD1 now pathologically turned on that if you went down that route, you would just get fat again?
No, I strongly believe, like, you know, perhaps sort of despite all of the evidence sort of suggesting otherwise, that like I can't see a theoretical reason why, you know, we sort of can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again once we understand how he works, right? Like, you know, because I don't think anyone has really like approached obesity like this before. And so I think I'm like, you know, I mean, maybe I'm crazy, but I feel like, you know, what's kind of amazing is that so much good science has been done in the last 20 years that I feel like I look at this now and I'm like, you know what? We actually have a pretty good idea of how this all works. But I think that you have to, approach the literature from the right mind frame to see it. Right. And I think that the scientists doing the research are thinking about, you know, how do we turn this into a pharmaceutical? Through, you know, random chance and circumstance, the actual reason that I got interested in the China health study was that at the time, this was 20 years ago, I was doing keto. Well, back then I was really doing Atkins, and my little brother, so the guy who did the China health study is a professor at Cornell, and he taught a vegetarian nutrition class at Cornell. And my little brother took his class and became a vegetarian. And so I was kind of debating with my brother, and I became interested in the subject matter. And that's when I bought my copy of the China health study and started looking at it, and, you know, continued to look at it for like the next 20 years, literally. But, you know, having that China health study sitting on my table and continuing to flip through it, it became impossible to, you know, stick with the idea that Atkins or keto is like, you know, the correct and proper way to go about things, even though I knew that they worked for me, right? Or they had worked for me in the past. And so that, you know, just that bit of like reality, you know, owning that book forced me to like change my preconceptions. And I knew, and then sure. And then I bought the farm here in New York, and I got this pamphlet. I like old farm literature, and my aunt's an antique collector. And I told her that I liked old, you know, agricultural literature. And she, like, for Christmas gave me like this stack of like pamphlets that the Cooperative Extension had put out like in the, you know, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And most of them were stupid. How to grow carrots, you know. And there was like 100 of them. Dumb, whatever. And then I was like, this one's interesting. And it was, and I've published this whole thing on my blog now, but in digital format, but it was the food. It was like, it's really about economics, food from the farm. That's what it's called.
Yep.
And so, and I start flipping through it, and they're listing like, and mind you, this is not about nutrition. It's about economics, and it's about how much money farm families can save by producing their own food. And it's showing how much of all the different, how much money these guys save by growing their own milk. And a lot, they all had dairy cows. Mm-hmm. And like the families that they profiled, it was like every day there would be like mom, dad, 2 kids, and like one hired guy who ate half of his meals there or something. And it was like every day they were going through 1 quart of cream, like a full quart of heavy cream. And then like, you know, 2 gallons of milk, 2 gallons of whole milk, probably from Jersey cows that was like 5-6% butter fat. Then like, you know, a couple pounds of butter a week, and, you know, beef and pork and egg, like a dozen eggs a day. And I just couldn't believe the amount of, you know, the amount of fat that traditional New York farming families ate, even to me, is mind-blowing. And I, for a long time, was like a very heavy consumer of fat because I was keto, and like, you know, that's what I was doing. And even from my perspective, I looked at this and was like, oh my God. You know, like, I don't know if you I saw that on my blog or looked at it all. But it's kind of mind-blowing. And you're like,
it's mind-blowing. Whoa.
And so then, you know, and then you count up the calories, and you're like, well, the calories must have been astronomical. And then, of course, and then my grandfather passed away, and he had all these old USDA Yearbook of Agricultures, and I was looking through those, and then I found that other study from like the 30s, and that was showing the amount of calories that city people ate in the US in the 1930s. And it totally confirms what the other pamphlet said, but it also actually had like calculated the calories.
Right.
And it showed that the most wealthy men in cities, so these would not have been the most physically active, were eating 4,500 calories a day in the 1930s. And you're like, huh.
When I read that,
it's kind of right. And so like all of these, all of this kind of background knowledge that sort of informs my viewpoint when I'm looking through the literature kind of came to me through random chance and happenstance. You know what I mean? There's no grand plan, but you stumble across enough things and you kind of then you, I guess, build your hypothesis from that. And then once you have that hypothesis, then you look at the literature and you're like, oh, well, this is really interesting. And that's, and it starts to come together and then you have a cohesive story. So it's fun.
And I think what that highlights maybe the most to me is that we did not all suddenly become like you say, gluttonous and sloths. Right. That is not the cause of obesity. We didn't just start eating way more than we ever ate and stop moving.
Right.
There's something else fundamentally going wrong. And I think when you take that perspective, it takes you down into, I guess, the rabbit holes that we've both fallen down is like something else has got to be going on.
Right. Exactly. Because the stories that were told by, the dietary powers that be just don't hold water.
No.
And more to the point, they've been broadly disproven. Like the idea that you can lose weight by just simply eating less. There's been 100 dietary trials done like that. And at the end of the day, they just don't work. Right? We know that doesn't work. So exercising more, we know that doesn't work either. That's been that works even less than restricting calories. It doesn't work at all when you actually test it.
Yeah.
We only have two ideas and they're both broadly disproven.
Yeah. One of my favorite blog posts you have, which I love basically all of them, is I think it was response to Ponzer's. And you talked about the Biggest Loser. And when I read that, these Biggest Losers, they lost hundreds of pounds, right? They were very big, lost a ton of weight. And the thing you noted, the study that they reference is we follow up 6 years later, they gained the weight back and some. The metabolisms did not totally recover from pre-competition levels. Right. That was the study. But I think the point that you brought up and what super got me thinking is because you compared them to the World War II conscious objectors who were basically starved and refed diets, presumably not super high in PUFAs because PUFAs were still not as widespread in the 40s, 50s. What if we took those Biggest Losers and refed them different diets? Would they become obese? Some, it depends.
Right.
My question is can we fix the machinery by forcing fat off like they did in the Biggest Loser? And regaining a normal non-hibernating metabolism because we saturate the fat when we refill.
Right. Well, and what I would like to do, and I don't know if this is possible, it's what I'm trying to figure out, is it possible to shift something so that you can lose weight while actually essentially continuing to eat the same number of calories, but either through, being very careful about exactly what you're eating, or perhaps by using the proper supplements or whatever it is, if you can find a way to tip the scale without reducing your caloric intake, you might actually be able to lose lose
the magic bullet.
Well, it's not even really a magic bullet. I guess what I'm saying is
people could do it.
Is there a way to lose the weight simply by increasing your metabolic rate
first?
And of course, that would mean reducing SCD1 probably. That would mean getting out of reductive stress. That would mean, one of the ways, of course, to get out of reductive stress is by reducing SCD1 and vice versa. So they all, it's all one big feedback loop, really. But it's how do you break out of that feedback loop? How do I magically go back to my lean weight the same way that the guy who had just completed the Guru Walla did, right? He just went back to eating his normal 3,300 calories a day or whatever it was.
Right.
And at his normal eating rate, he lost the 30 kilograms because his metabolic rate was normal.
Not sleeping.
Not broken, right? He wasn't broken, and he'd never eaten PUFA. And therefore, once he stopped overeating, once he stopped purposefully overeating, the weight just came off, and he never did any dieting.
Right.
He just lived his life.
Yep.
And that's how it should be, right? And so that's what I'm trying. Yeah, that's my question is like, is there a way to get back to that without having to like fast all of the weight off? Because
that's my question. Is that the only
because
way?
the problem with fasting all the weight off is that it kills your metabolic rate. And sure, maybe once you've
killed it all off,
there's a way to rebuild it,
and then you rebuild it. That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, like I don't know.
Because if the stored PUFA in adipose is the cause of the problem, and you can't fix the cause without getting rid of what I think the supplement that to me is the most seems, I don't know, maybe a few of them work, but like I like how you explain it. The stearic acid, if you're taking a lot of stearic acid in, maybe you can take enough where you increase the octane of the blend so much that even though you have a lot of stored PUFA, you're burning it with this super high octane blend that's enough to get you out of the hibernation mode.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And we don't, right. So there's a lot of different ideas, and I don't know what, I'm hoping that the succinate can sort of do that same thing of like, one thing we know about succinate, interestingly, is that in mice anyways, succinate is vastly preferentially taken in by brown fat, which is thermogenic fat. And so it's possible that succinate can help build your brown fat tissue. I don't know if it does that, but I think it does in mice. Will that happen in humans? I don't know. Who can say? But yeah, that's right. So hopefully there's a way to do this. One thing I do want to that I like to reiterate is that actually, I mean, in most obese people, even though I argue that this whole thing starts with eating too much PUFA, most obese people don't actually have that high amount of stored PUFA. And most of the reason for that is that, once you get torpid, then you start cranking out monounsaturated fats. And so if you look at obese people, they're actually full of MUFA. They're not really full of PUFA. And so that's really mostly what we have to get rid of. But either way, it's the unsaturated fat. But on the other hand, maybe it's easier to get rid of MUFA than it is to get rid of PUFA. So maybe that's good news. I'm not sure. But obviously if the SCD1 is there, well, and the other thing, here's the other thing that I don't know about SCD1. So SCD1 lives in the endoplasmic reticulum. And the endoplasmic reticulum is kind of like the highway of the cell. And so the SCD1 definitely affects your the saturation level of your stored fat. But what I don't know is like if I eat stearic acid, when it's taken into a cell to be metabolized, as it passes through the cytoplasm on the way to the mitochondria, is SCD1 there, sitting there and intercepting it and desaturating it before it can actually make it to the mitochondria? Right. And I don't know the answer of that.
Because then
that's something I wonder about.
Right. That would hurt the ability of that. You talk about first in, first out, right? If I eat all the stearic acid, is that going to be the first thing I'm going to burn? Which makes sense because it doesn't have to break it down again, right?
Right.
But yeah, that's actually a very interesting question.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer. I don't know. I don't even know how you do that experiment. It'd be very hard.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I have to think about it. That experimental design. I want to see if I can get volunteers to sign up for mine, or do a virtual Biggest Loser event, and then do a proper refeed and see how it works.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Well, Brad, I thank you so much for your time. I mean, we chatted forever. This has been awesome, like a dream conversation for me. So I appreciate it. We probably went into a lot of details for like detailed information for people to get into the weeds a little bit.
Yeah, I feel like we did a good job of not getting too lost down in the weeds. We had to talk about the mitochondrial bottleneck a little bit, but
yeah, I mean, that stuff to me, it's so interesting, and it helps people to know, like, hey, why not eat that polyunsaturated fat, or maybe why not eat so much oleic acid, why olive oil may not be the number one fat to go to. But anyways, I appreciate it, Brad. And again, I'll link to your meats, the supplements, and of course the blog of the year, my nominee. So I appreciate all the work you've done, because it's really helped me think about this stuff that I was thinking about for a long time, and like you clarified it for me, like I didn't have to do any of the work. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, thank you for having me on.
All right. I will hopefully talk to you soon. I'll see you on Twitter.
All right. Sounds great.
All right. Bye, Brad.
All right. Good to meet you. Bye-bye.